Honorable Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Centre for Public Policy Research, Kochi, I would like to welcome you all to a talk on the logic of urban contemporary geographies in the making. The Centre for Public Policy Research is a think tank dedicated towards extensive and in-depth research on current economic, social and political issues, striving to initiate policy change by publishing our research and framing policy debates and discussions on various subjects. This talk is being organized by one of the focus study centers within CPPR, the Centre for Urban Studies. The Centre for Urban Studies has worked on projects relating to urban governance, public transport, and policy issues surrounding paratransit systems and disruptive transport services. In order to create a larger dialogue around the process of development and to move beyond generic debates on the subject, we are happy to host a number of experts on the area as part of our in-house lecture series, Urban Voices. The world over, people are moving towards cities and urbanized areas. India, following this trend, has been embarking on an era of rapid urbanization, with estimates stating that by 2050, 50% of the population will be living in urbanized areas. As in many sectors relating to human development, Kerala is ahead of the curve, with close to 47% of the population living in urban areas according to the 2011 census. This large population is also attributed to the fact that the state has a large urban-rural continuum with very few truly rural zones left. Ernakulam, or Kochi, the commercial capital of the state, is considered the most urbanized in terms of physical and development and population. Currently, Kochi finds itself at an interesting juncture, wherein a number of developmental projects are being undertaken and much attention is on the city as it has been selected as one of the 20 smart cities. The outcome of these projects will greatly affect the experience of the city in years to come and could be a deciding factor in the development trajectory that the city takes on, becoming a livable and sustainable city or an overcrowded and overbuilt city. However, before focusing on the urban future of the city, it is important to look back and understand how we got where we are. In order to gauge the outcome of current developmental projects, it is necessary to understand the logic of urban development that the city has followed up till now. Our speaker today, Dr. Mathew A, has worked extensively in this field. Dr. Varghese teaches in the Department of Political Science, Maharajas College, Ernakulam. He received his PhD from the University of Bergen, Norway, where he worked on spatial reconfigurations and new social formations in contemporary urban context of Kerala. I request our speaker to take over now.
I can just speak through it right now. So, good morning to all, and it's always good to have a dialoguing forum before you, and many of the people in the network have been doing exactly that for a long time, and it's always interesting to be here. So, I was thinking how to go about, because sometimes you have to carve a topic out of an idea that you have, and then go back to the topic and see how to bring out the logic that you had in mind when you were making the topic. So I would rather go about trying to explain the terminologies that I use in the topic, whereby I'll go through the paper. What I'll do is I'll first go through the idea of logic as used in the topic of logic of urban contemporary, geographies in the making. Then I go to preliminary into the idea of urban, and then go to contemporary or contemporaneity as an idea, and then go to the subtopic. But before that, before I go to geographies as such, I'd rather go to the idea of space as in the way it has been theorized, as in relation with state as a format, and then go to how geographies are possibly being structured in the contemporary context. Kochi, I put it in
a bracket because I was not sure whether I would focus right on Kochi, but probably Kochi will be a paradigm or a paradigmatic model of urban processes as they happen in the present time around this region. So, if I may start with the idea of logic. I don't know whether you're already familiar with Slavoj Zizek and Frederick Jameson's work. Frederick Jameson had a breakthrough in his studies on capitalism when he published his work at first as an essay called Postmodernism or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism in 1984. Then it came out as a book in 1991. Likewise, Slavoj Zizek had a work which is more like an extended essay called Multiculturalism as the Cultural Logic of Multinational Capitalism. That was in 1997. I have both of these works in picture because probably the idea of logic comes a lot out of the way these people have been theorizing logic in both these titles. Jameson, for him, postmodernism as an abstract idea could not be left like that. So he goes into some of the specific sectors in which, after modernity, lots of revisions have taken place. He goes into architecture, he goes into the way novels were written, he goes into the way spaces were reshaped, and he goes into the way the economic system has a relationship with the culture as an entity. So the logic that he has a subject called postmodernity. So postmodernity as, or postmodernism as the cultural logic of late capitalism. Only in late capitalist phase can there be a postmodern kind of thinking. You couldn't have a holistic picture. You could only have fragmented thoughts, for instance. Likewise, Slavoj Zizek's multiculturalism, seemingly a very forward kind of an idea, he brings out a critique of multiculturalism by saying that in the era of multinational capitalism, there is a particular way in which people recognize the other. You recognize the other, but not quite in terms of accommodating that person, but in terms of seeing the other as an offbeat category. It's not really bringing them into the process, a common process, but multiculturalism is a way in which, like you have commodities arranged in a shelf in a commoditized world, you have different identities arranged in a shelf, but not quite exchanging. So he brought out multiculturalism as a logical version of multinational capitalism. Only in multinational capitalism's context there could be multiculturalism. Now I had a problem. My problem was when I have logic of urban contemporary Kochi, I don't have a subject there. I don't have a multiculturalism, I don't have a postmodernism there. I am in the process of trying to find whether there is a subject called for the urban contemporary or the contemporary forms of urbanization as you find around our places. So this is an exploration. This is a thinking which is going aloud, and towards the end I would probably have some pointers thrown towards, is there a logic that you could find in the processes that you see around. The second idea, which is urban, and of course urbanization and global relationships have always had deep historical impacts all along the western coast in India, so it's nothing new. And there are sometimes efforts to link urbanization as being inaugurated by colonial processes. But even that has problems because before colonialism there were heterarchic coastal city formations that networked with each other, not quite in the way monumental kingdoms were there in the rest of the parts of India, but small networks which had trade links with systems like the Indian Ocean trade networks. So it is into that kind of a format that a colonial kind of an urban process comes in. So it's nothing new. But what is new at the present urban turn is probably the unprecedented tendencies of certain ruptures from the earlier patterns of urbanization as seen in the western coast. So, but before that, what is urban as a process. This has been interrogated for a long time, and one of my favorite explanations is by saying that it's a certain function of absorbing capital. It's in a way, it absorbs capital, the kind of capital which is produced in surplus is absorbed and put into a particular kind of a use. The logic is the use that you find, and urban is the shape that you get. So it's in a particular way the absorption of surplus capital, and the physicality of urban through history is something which is the physicality of urbanization, like you see in a city, or the formats of the city that you see around, is a way of solving a crisis. You know what happened with the Paris revolutions in 1840s, when the workers and the laborers had a big revolt across Paris, and which was threatening to spread across Europe, was that Napoleon came out with an idea that, okay, the only way to control this question is to build a city. Come out with an infrastructural solution. This is what Harvey and people talk a lot about. Solution, urban as a solution. And this infrastructural project, the kind of streets which were imagined of that time, the kind of architecture that people like Haussmann came out, broad streets. So you can't have a protest, because in a broad street you could be easily pointed out. So these kinds of architectural solutions, urban solutions, were at times a way to mitigate a crisis that the system perceives as a threat. So this has continued through time. So urbanization is a channel through which first the surplus capital flows and builds cities, and in a way it is an absorption process, and next it is also a way of addressing different types of crises that comes at different points of history. Now, why can there be a spatial kind of imagination in the urban process? Because space as such is also a physical category. I mean, space has a lot of other ways of being imagined. There is, you have the relativity theory coming up, and then there is different imagination of space. Before relativity theory comes up, there is another imagination of space which is more linear. But in this present context, space comes as the first ever thoughts in urban studies that came into sociology and social sciences in the 1920s, with the ecological theories coming up. The kind of theories that, if you are familiar with Robert Park's theory, the ecological theory, which adopted the perspective that the city itself is a natural habitat. It's a natural habitat of human beings. So if you say that something is a natural habitat, there is an underlying problem. The underlying problem is something called equilibrium. So if there is something that goes equilibrium, you balance it. It's natural. So it's not, you don't really interrogate the city, you see city as a ecological whole. It is almost like a way of seeing biology, your blood system, your circulation system. It has a way of maintaining an equilibrium. That's how you imagine city in the ecological perspective. So as plants and animal forms are studied under ecology, human ecology too is a parallel study of spatial and temporal relationships of humans. Then a breakthrough came with the works of George Simmel, who tried to link city to the complexity of life intimately connected to money economy. Now, he studied why city behaves in a certain way by placing it in the social context of the forms of market which was there during that time. So it is not natural. It's a byproduct of the kind of market relationships that was there at that particular point of time. So Simmel's work was an intervention in sociology. And then there are interesting works by Max Weber. There is in fact a work by Max Weber called The Cities, which is lesser known than his more famous works, in which he talks about a time in which early cities were fortified cities. There was a fort, and inside the fort there was a different system. Sometimes it will be part of a colony. Sometimes it will be part of a system which stays away from what is outside. So when the fortified kind of cities were breaking up, Max Weber talked about citizens transforming into representatives of the state. Citizens suddenly, city becomes part of the state, and citizens represent the state. Now you have something called populations. So you have populations and you have statistics as a science coming up to address the populations. Statistics is a way in which, I mean, you're quite familiar with that probably. It's a way of enumerating the people. So population is a basic entity of state as such. So Weber was writing about that kind of a format. So unlike many social scientists who read that kind of city dynamics, there is a breakthrough that again came with the Marxist studies, refeaturing in works of people like Henry Lefebvre, who talked about the production of space. Now, again, the idea of space comes up, and they say that space is not something which is there as such, but space is something which is continuously being generated. So, Lefebvre, according to Lefebvre, space is relational. It comes as a part of relationship. So space is the physical space encounter. You encounter lots of physical spaces when you go out. It is that kind of physical space, and then the kind of sense that you make out of your encounter. What is the kind of sense that you get from a physical? What is the kind of sense that you get, for instance, if you go out, you see a billboard covering the physical space that you are walking through, and the billboard structures your vision. There is something written on the billboard, probably get smart Kochi, or things like that. What is the kind of intervention that that kind of a spatial feature has? And then there are different representations of space which are made by people in their everyday life. People represent space in certain ways. For instance, you have in Malayalam there is a word called Vedivattam. Vedivattam is a concept in which people come together without any bar, get into a conversation like a dialogue here, and then probably around a tree. But these kinds of public spaces were not always there. These were sometimes controlled by early forms of state structures and caste orders and things like that. It took a form of reform movements to address this and convert controlled spaces to public spaces. So how people represent their space is also an issue. So now Lefebvre's intervention through his Marxist methodology sees space simultaneously as a dialectics, as an engagement of the physical space, the relational space, and the way you represent the space. And then there are other configurations of space that comes out when different places were compared. So early when I was doing my research, the first work was on public spaces. Then I tried to shift my focus into the kind of urban formats which are taking shape around our region. And then there were people from East Asia and places like that who talked about another way in which urban format was getting engaged in Malaysia and those countries. Where, for instance, the East Asian case material, unlike the material in Kerala, had never an experience of that kind of a global engagement that Kerala had. The new economy came out of the blue, and it placed itself on top of the some of the East Asian centers of organization. So the way in which Islam as a religion engaged with globalization, the way in which globalization doesn't really come out as a meta process, but it comes out as a relational concept to whatever is there, was what they studied. So Aihwa Ong, one of the key theorists, talks about the way in which sovereignties are getting restructured in contemporary context. So, and then there are these very interesting observations like that of Harvey, which in fact sees space as something which, like we mentioned earlier, is a solution to different kinds of crises. But what Harvey misses out, David Harvey, misses out is the specific focus on the populations and the anthropology and the social construct of populations in different parts of the world. So he sees it as a process that is very much similar to the way it happens in New York. But there is a very interesting thought which comes out of his engagement with space as well. So now space and state is something which I want to put together before I come back to the idea of geography towards the end. Now what is state as such? This is also a question that always engages people. I mean, what is this concept of state? What are the state forms that emerge in new contexts? Whether the state forms that you are used to is changing when we are talking about. So, modern nation states have always evolved with ideas like territory, population, legitimate power to exercise violence or force, like you see in legal systems and things like that. It's legitimate. And these are the way characteristics of states. So what is happening probably now is that this format of the state is slowly transforming into another mode in which the idea of corporation, which is the body that routinely comes together and acts like a kin group. You know, if you're familiar with the sociological and anthropological ideas, there is this kinship ties and familial networks and such formations that has a way of coming together and acting as one body, corpora. Corpora is the body. So corporation as an idea comes from the idea of corpora. So these corporations have a way in which modeling the new states in their making. So corporations sometimes gain huge power and they model the state which you are familiar with in terms of the corporations. What essentially happens is that state used to be also a body that has contract with you. It's a contract. So the contract is that you have certain arrangement with the state and there is a welfare that the state will provide. Now what happens in the corporate transformation or the corporate state is that the welfare promises given away. It's given away and the state becomes more like a managerial structure in which the only responsibility that it has is it's not really the welfareist measure, but it's in a way, if I put it in a more critical sense, policing. That's what remains with the state. So it has a governance capability which is very much akin to a policing. When something goes off order, the state will come. Otherwise, the state is nowhere in the picture. So there you don't have schools, you don't have hospitals, you don't have any apparatus that runs on welfare, but the state is there. State is there as a controlling agent. So in these kinds of ways, the state and the space as studied in sociology or social sciences, and the state as a format is transformed. Now I come to the next term, which is a bit more problematic, which is called contemporary. What is contemporary? And there was a talk which we listened to a long time back, probably when we were doing our undergraduation. This was given by Noam Chomsky, and in this talk he was talking about common sense. What is common sense? And we were thinking, why should somebody talk about common sense? It's common sense. That's it. But it was not precisely that. A common sense is something manufactured through the media that we have, the kind of structures that are power holding. And your common sense is not an easy concept. It's a problematic concept through which you justify the system. So likewise, contemporary is also a problematic concept, but not in the sense of common sense again, but it's a particular way in which you have relationship with your own time. It is a very difficult process. When you are living in a particular system, when you are following a certain order of living, it's very difficult to reflect on that order of living. You seldom do that. You just live. In a way, the only thing that you can do when you want to reflect on your order of living is that you go to the past or you go to the future. You talk about a time that is to come, in which you imagine a particular kind of, for instance, an urban picture that is to come, something is going to get smart or something is going to happen. This is the future, things like that, or you go to the past. So when I was first trying to do my research, the problem that I had with my first 2 chapters was that I was dwelling a lot on the past. I was trying to engage with the past and I couldn't come out of it. And then somebody was talking to me and they pointed out this is the problem that you will have, because it's very difficult to engage with what you have now. Because what you have now is what you're living. So you can't engage that easily with contemporary. That's why the contemporaneity aspect will form one of the bases in which I'll try to engage with city through the region of Kochi or Ernakulam. So the contemporary is he who or she who holds firmly the gaze on his own time, so that to perceive it is a difficult process. You know about enlightenment in Europe? The enlightenment in Europe was a time in which people started reflecting on the time they were living. That's why you had lots of new thoughts coming up. It's a difficult process, but Michel Foucault writes about it. He says that you stand away from your own time and you gaze back at the time. This is ethnography as well. In ethnography, in anthropology, ideally, not the colonial versions of ethnography, you're studying the other and imagining the other as something related to the ape. Not that kind of ethnography. But the critical ethnography that you find now is in a way engagement with the now. So the engagement with the now is what we'll try to do in the following session. So if I may have something already mentioned before. This used to be one of those typical scenes if you travel in small towns in Kerala. You have these small marketplaces. Sometimes fish is brought there and exchanged, and something which I was more familiar with is since I come from Alua. If you have heard of the Shivaratri in Manalpuram, there is a riverside, river bank there, and then there is this festival happening during Shivaratri. What usually happens, at least some decades back, is that people bring earthenware, pots and things like that from the eastern hills. They bring it there. People from the low-lying areas bring their own products. They engage into a barter system. So this barter system happens mostly in river banks, and this barter system usually has mythical arrangements and mythical stories related with that. And these river banks transform themselves to an entrepot, an exchange place. And earlier Shivaratri Manalpuram Alua used to be a Buddhist center as well. And so it speaks a lot about the Kerala history as well, how the Buddhist center transformed to a Nambudiri based order later. Because this was basically a transfer of the economic authority from the Buddhist traders to the Nambudiris. It was also an economic transfer. But later, now when you see the Shivaratri Manalpuram, it's just a cultural event. You don't get the base of it, you only get the superstructure of it. So this is much smaller scale market which you can find all across Kerala, which is probably dilapidating now. And then these are such river zones and things like that. So what may be gleaned from the present settlement patterns and movement of people in their historical embeddedness in urban process is that it's not locally determined. None of the processes that you see in urban context are locally determined. You try to think that it's a local kind of version of urbanization, but it's not quite local. On the other hand, starting from early global systems like Indian Ocean networks that I tried to talk about, that extrapolated from Coromandel coast, they were thoroughly global. So here, moments of history like encounters with foreign corporate networks, these are the more known global interactions. But earlier as well, it has always been global, as Eric Wolff and people like that used to talk. Engagements, people, the places, the locality, the local has always been global in a way. If you look at the early settlements of certain communities, in this sense, Syrian Christians, what may be attributed from the movement of families from place to place is the engagement that they have with a peculiar kind of economic process in that region. They moved in a particular pattern. So this is a map in 1606. It's from a Portuguese traveler, and these maps trace the movement of people through the then Kerala. The map of Kerala boundaries, the modern map, that's serrated map, it was not there. In fact, some even say that if you want to find the center of Kerala during that time, there was no Kerala during that time, but if you want to find the center of that place, you wouldn't probably find it in the land. You probably find it somewhere in the sea. So this even remains so now, because the continuing engagement of people from the west coast, not just Kerala, all through the west coast have been also networked with the Indian Ocean systems. So such global implications have always been there. And before the coming of, this is again a map that I tried to make. People have always been relating in regions through several relationships and practices.
This is for instance, this is the region I try to study, the present Kakinada. And earlier also there used to be lots of trade routes of people migrating. Kudungalur is the early trade center, from where migrations have happened to Parur, Edapalli, the church, the early church in Edapalli, had a lot of connection with the early trade settlements as well. And the first division that emerged out of it built another religious institution there. Then there was another channel that went into Angamali. These are all peta-like structures, guild-like structures in which merchants came together. There was a significant Jewish population as well during that time. So the mobility of people across places already carve the global onto the region that you have at a particular point of time. This in itself could be a point of dialogue, but in a different format. But in the case of modern state, the coming of a centralizing state process towards 1900s left fewer spaces of exemption from dominant orders. As a result of urban process, also became more centralized. People in places, in many cases, ceased to be active participants in the process of urbanization. What I indicate that, this probably, by the way, is the temple entry proclamation in Kochi. But what I want to indicate at is that heterarchic urban structures that was pointed at earlier. The small networks that link with rivers, that link with the Indian structures, and then in Kollam you have another one, Kochi you have another one, then you have another one in Vaikam in Kochi. These are not having a centralized order. But what happens with the coming of modern state is that all these centers will be linked to state. And the cities that you have as a result, an Ernakulam, a Kollam, or a Kottayam of the modern state is a representative of the state. So the people in the process don't have as much freedom as part of the urban structures that they live with. So urbanization is there, but in a different way and with a different control with the coming of modern states. And then you go to the contemporary urban context of Kerala. So in the case of contemporary urban context, by the way, this is the site of building of smart city. It's a view from the fence. At the point when we went there, we were not allowed to be in. So I thought it's better to have a snap from outside the fence and with the core over there. So it will communicate a lot about the way in which the cities get smart. So the possible reconfigurations of state during contemporary global process, neoliberal, capitalist as you may call, cannot be understood if that process is depicted as abstract space that play out global against local, subject against object, structure against agency, not like that. Instead, what may be important are the ways in which life forms, people, negotiate changing relationships in the present urban scenario. That's what probably becomes important. How people access urban regions. What is the kind of relationship that you have with the urban region? How are brokers around this place relating to the urban space of Kochi before the smart city in fact becomes, or in physicality becomes real. Before that itself, people start interacting with the idea of smartness. You can find similar examples in the idea of gated living that is advertised all across Kerala. In fact, you don't have that gated living when you see it first in the billboards. But you are always told that something is insecure around you. There are certain things that are getting off the hook. So you need to go and live in a gated zone. So you invest in a gated zone before it in fact starts materializing. The kind of life that you structure is also different even before the structure actually comes up. So in a way the virtuality starts to restructure the reality. So it's a vice versa process. So there are certain structural reversions that happen. What happens simultaneously is that the earlier kinds of urban structures, this is one of those familiar godowns in Kochi, you can see more of those around there, they are no more of these. So if I could talk a little bit about one of the cases in Pallikara, where it's a small town near Kakinada, small village near Kakinada, where I tried to understand what were the processes, economic processes in which people were involved in.
one of the urban processes in which people were involved in during that time, it's only some decades back in 1950s, is the transfer of red stones from that region in Kallivallams, big boats which are rowed through rivulets that goes to the Tevara backwaters, and then from there to Mattancherry. The earlier bazaars of Mattancherry were structured from the stones that came from Pallikara, and from Mattancherry there were lots of everyday use salt and things like that that went into Pallikara market. So when you want to buy something, what you do is, when you transfer these stones, you get 5 or 6 sticks for polygon. So you make a bundle of it, and that's your currency. And with that currency, you go to, this is a time in which the other currencies are also there. But you have another way of economy here, in which you exchange this to get the food products from the Wednesday markets. So what you see now is that parallel to a dominant economic process, this is also during the time of colonialism, you have another way of engaging with the urban, which that kind of option is no more there. You don't get exemption like that now. You always have to engage with the dominant forms of urbanization that you find out. That is probably a change that you find in the present context. These are also incidental, but roads and streets, you tend to imagine that roads have always been like this. People used to walk like that. But this photo comes after the reform movement. So only after the reform movements, people get a chance to walk like that in a mixed way through a road in Kerala. So before that, there are different kinds of protocols that are there. Some people have to keep a particular kind of distance from the other person in terms of for caste order or things like that. And again, then I'm a bit veering away. The caste as such is a function of the colonial process which was there in Kerala. So it's not a meta idea which is there all across India, but caste was a sublimation of the Jadi concept which was here, which the colonial economy molded into a casteist order. What essentially happened was that the caste relationships were molded into a land-based feudal order in which the Nambudiri or the Nambudiri clans held the center position, and then there you can see a hierarchical arrangement of caste in terms of land ownership. So you can collect taxes better in that sense. So it's better to hold that kind of a caste structure. What happened was when the new economy was thrown open with the plantation, cash crops, small scale industries, coir, people started seeing other avenues of economic engagements, and the reform movements coincide with the late colonial experience. So in 1920s, when Srinarayana Guru talks about reforms, he's not just talking about reforms, he's also talking about entrepreneurialism. How to be entrepreneurial to engage with caste, and how to make spaces public. It's not just temple entry that they were aiming at, it was an entry to public spaces that they were aiming at. So, and then these are also the what I earlier mentioned. This is the Shivratri Manalpuram. Earlier it was a trading space. This is a film in which people are relaxed and they sit and talk in that place. And now this is something which you see all across places. You hardly get to see the river. You have a wall between you and the river. In fact, in Scandinavia, if you have a river, you have a right to get the wind from the river. For instance, if he has a home near the river, if I want to get the wind from the river and do fishing there, he has to give me the right to be there. You can't cut that off like this. But here, in this kind of urban format, there is a particular way in which control systems are coming, protocols are coming. Anyway, that's another issue. But now, particular regions have been points in the mosaic of complexities, any region. But the economic reforms initiated in the early 1990s affected unprecedented homogenization of places. You find Kochi in another part as well. That's why I said, I don't know whether I will be engaging with the idea of Kochi as such. Because if you go to Alappuzha also, if you talk to people, they also want a Kochi there. So Kochi is jumping from one place to the other. So the dominant social paradigms were clamped down, and this is conveyed by the normative context of special economic zones and urban reform plans which have come up of late. and it's taking different shapes. JNU RM was one, and then now probably you'll have more of those. And before I come to that, what is special about the contemporary, coming back to the idea of contemporaneity, is that in post-liberalization context, the nation state in India enters its post-developmental phase as well. This does not mean that the state has become less important. It is there. The early states that we talked about, even if it becomes corporate, it's there. But it means that the state has become important in a different way. So that is what sometimes causes a problem for them. So the corporate operation in the state at present has specificities like control they exercise through agents within the state structures, as in the case of Dubai-based interventions that we are more familiar with, or other interventions from outside that the states mediate into your everyday life. Unlike familiar urban types of a couple of decades back, there is a distinct possibility of cities coming up in Kerala at any designated space, and any designated space can turn smart at any time. So it's like city planting. You can plant the smartness anywhere with this model. And this model really don't have to engage with the locality, even though it said that this comes at a particular point because it has a early urban history. No, it can come at any point as well. It can come at tabula rasa and then reconnect to form a new urban idea. So this is the possibility that the new urban is bringing up, and the challenges that it brings up with it. So now states are encouraged to enter into new processes like the public-private partnerships or PPPs in the context of reduction of plan allocations that urban centers have, urban local bodies have, and emerging priorities like urban renewal, like the redevelopment of old areas, are also important. So Kochi, the early Kochi now becomes a heritage. So in the emerging structure, the early urban spaces have a different role. Ernakulam is no more the zone of urbanization. It's a post-colonial typical city. Kochi was a pre-colonial city, and both these places have a different role at the present context, and now the urbanization that you get now is in the peripheral zones. And the periphery comes and takes back the center, and it takes back the center as a heritage zone or an old urban center. So you get these kinds of transformations. And what happens as a result is that ideas start going in search of cities. In places that have been transformed into spaces of futuristic growth, people transact with the discourse of desire and hope, and are subjects less of a long-lasting interconnections and more of a disconnected, competing tendencies in life. What happens is, that's why I said contemporary, because you don't have a chance to engage with contemporary. You have a chance to talk about hope, desire, urgency to get urban. If you don't join it, you will be out of this smart city bandwagon, for instance. So better join. Or if you don't get Vikasana, you suddenly become anachronistic. So there is a way in which you are accommodated in the process. And I would like to also talk about the imagination, the geographical imagination behind the idea of Vikasana as a concept. The earlier idea of development, the Malayalam word Purogati, was very much related to development. Purogati has its own problems, has its own way of marginalizing people. Sometimes when you build a dam, you get rid of the people there. But Purogati has a social backing to it of going together towards something. Vikasana is an expansion. It's like, the imagination is that of, it goes like that. When you go like that, you also congest people on both sides. So it's a typical capitalist way of accommodating people back into the system by expanding. And when you expand, you can either come in or you get reduced to the bare life outside. These are the only two possibilities that you have. So this is also a new geographical imagination. And the same place that I talked about, from where the stones go to Matanjeri, suddenly becomes carved up like that as a result. It carved up to suit the global needs which are being engaged with in the new cities in the making. So there are no more hillocks that remain. When there are no more hillocks that remain in Kerala, there is an ecological consequence. The wind, the surface wind that flows through the land is prevented by the small hillocks before it reaches the Western Ghats. Now what geographers say is that the winds have become more powerful and it hits the Western Ghats more powerfully and it's degrading the Ghats in a much higher pace. So there are ecological consequences as well to such processes. Neoliberalism has developed in fact into an extremely malleable technology that instead of limiting the scope of governance becomes instituted practices in urban situations and creates exceptions to business as usual by characteristics embeddings. So this is one of the embedding of a neoliberal format of urbanization. So ideas like globalization or neoliberalism may not work as, it's not an abstract idea. You know, it works differently in different places and it's situated. It's situated amongst the actors who are there, the kind of projects which are taking place, the kind of histories which are being shaped in the region, as well as the kind of practices which are going on currently. So these are just a few slides, and I believe that the research in social sciences should critically engage with contemporaneity as a condition in itself. And reflexive ethnography, because I tried to bring in an anthropology to it, reflexive ethnography unravels how human ecologies work and the extent to which we become constituent elements or agents of contemporaneity as a condition. There, one of my favorite concepts is the concept of Anthropocene. Probably many of you are familiar with the idea of Anthropocene. It's being used by many people now, but Anthropocene is it's a time in which humans start having unprecedented effect upon the nature of the processes that are around, to the extent that it starts affecting them back. So there is a cyclical arrangement as a function of the human engagement with Earth. So, but in the Anthropocene, what becomes evident is that the divisions or the boundaries that you are used to before, like between life and non-life, becomes insignificant. You engage with processes in a much more dialogic way. And the Anthropocene is one of the areas in which probably you can dig and try to find your contemporary. You know, the Anthropocene era. It's very difficult. You have to do an archaeology to find the now. It's an irony. You know, you usually do the archaeology to find the past, or you go to a futuristic style. But you have to do an archaeology of the now. If you have to bring, or if you imagine to bring a subject which I am in search for.